then. Welcome to our final session of Conversations with the Bible. This is 1 hour series has given us the opportunity to hear from leading biblical scholars as they share their research and insights on a wide range of topics. And I think it has been such a gift when you can understand it. And I'm sorry about last week. That was a lot. That was heavy. Anyhow, today I am truly delighted to welcome Dr. Pat Dutcher-Walls. Pat is the retired professor of Hebrew Bible and former dean at the Vancouver School of Theology. She's written numerous books and articles with a particular focus on women in the Hebrew Bible, the Ancient Israelite Household, and the sociological and archaeological context of ancient Israel. Her book, Reading the Historical Books, A Student's Guide to Engaging the Biblical Texts, is one I consistently include on my course reading lists. I have known Pat since 2009. Can you believe that, Pat?
Wow,
I know.
that's a long
I know.
time.
It's a very long time. When I had the privilege of being her student, I know I took every course she taught, and my favorite was definitely the sociology of ancient Israel. Since those days in the classroom, Pat has become a really good friend. We have worked together in many different contexts over the years. She even traveled to Grand Prairie to lead the ACW conference here, just before she became moderator of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. Pat lives in Burnaby, where she continues to be deeply involved in ministry at a church doing creative and meaningful work. I am so grateful for her friendship and her mentorship over the years, and I only wish we lived closer so we could catch up in person more often. We're pretty
Indeed.
far away. So please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Pat Dutcher-Walls.
Hello, thank you. Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and hello to all of you. That's very nice. So I have a PowerPoint that I will show, and that'll be the bulk of the talk this evening. And Marianne and I decided that I would talk on sort of the social world of ancient Israel, and in particular, how families and the household fit into the society of ancient Israel. So, and I've done back in 2000, I did an archaeological dig. I was in Israel for a month doing a dig. So some of the pictures are from that, and others of the pictures are from the Biblical Archaeology Reader and things like that. So a bunch of pictures to really illustrate so that you have a sense of where and how ancient Israelites lived. The other part of that I'm very concerned of is that for some people, just talking about the society of ancient Israel becomes kind of academic. It's just like, I'm a sociologist and this is ancient history, ancient sociology. But I'm pretty convinced that if you understand what the household was like, if you understand what the world, the context of ancient Israel was like, it actually illustrates what you actually read in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible itself. So what I've done in this slideshow is intersperse information about the society with texts from the Bible itself where you see, oh, that's what that text is talking about. And so let me just share my screen here and get going. Okay, so can you see that all right? Okay, now can you see my red cursor that I'm moving around? Marianne, can you tell me, can you see the cursor?
Yes, I can.
You
Yep,
can,
it's all,
okay.
yep, it's all
Because
right.
I'll use that as a pointer as we go through. And now I can't see any of you guys. So Marianne, I guess if somebody has like an urgent question that they really need, if you would field that and let me know that they have a question.
Yep, I
If,
can do that.
however, if there aren't any like urgent questions, what I'll do is I'll go through the slide set and then we will have time afterwards to have lots of time for questions. So let me just turn my microphone down a little bit. Output volume, okay. Okay, we just don't need it to be that loud. Okay. All right, so let me go back up. So the Israelite household in the society of ancient Israel. So when you think about ancient Israel, there were two basic social realities for the Israelite household. The first was, and the first and for most of the people in the population, they lived in a small village, in a household that was based on an extended family. Almost all of them were peasants. In other words, lived close to the land, did not have a lot of money, and their basic form of wealth, if you will, was farming. So they were rural, peasant households that lived in small villages. And that was a huge portion of the population of ancient Israel. Then there was a very small class or upper class that were based in cities, so urban, and those power classes were based almost exclusively in relationship to the monarchy. So almost all of ancient societies throughout the ancient Near East were monarchic in structure, so they had a king or an emperor at the top, and those upper classes all related to and got their power and often their wealth from the king or from owning vast tracts of land that the king had given them. So they were a very powerful but very small elite set of classes that were related, almost always related to the monarchy. They were priests, they were army people, they were major landowners, they were the king's advisors, they were the upper classes. So those were the two basic social realities for ancient Israel. Those upper classes maybe made up 5% of the population, so very, very small and very rich. And then everybody else was some level of peasant farming, so maybe 95%. Now, some of the farmers were a little bit better off. They might have owned a little bit more land. Their family had inherited land that was more fertile. Other families were poorer. People who couldn't make it as a farmer, who got into debt and lost their land, they might be actually the poor, and they might be completely dependent on handouts, or they might be just like wanderers, or they might move to the cities, and then in the city they became the urban poor. So there was a range of the peasants and the farming families, but all of them, their wealth and power paled at, like, it was just a tiny, tiny bit of the amount of wealth and power that those upper classes were able to hold. So that's the basic social reality we have. So, and that context is the context for everything in the Hebrew Bible. And one of the things about a social world, when you're talking about an ancient text, like the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the writers of those ancient texts just assumed that social world. They didn't stop to describe it, they just assumed it. That was the world they lived in. It was their context. So they didn't actually set out to write like a sociology of ancient Israel. They just talked about families and farming and animals and the king and the wealthy classes and the priests. So they knew that society from the inside out. They didn't really describe it, but they referred to it all the time when they wrote their texts. So the context is visible in the texts of the Hebrew Bible if you know what you're looking for. One of the things I will say, and this is, Harry might want to correct me, Harry Meyer, but a lot of the kinds of things I'm talking about here are quite similar in the New Testament as well. The shape of the household for peasants was very similar. The type of farming was very similar. So some of what we're saying here would hold true in the New Testament context as well. So the first part of this talk is the land and agricultural production within the extended family context in these small villages. So we're going to look at the small village and how the extended families organize themselves, how they farm the land. So this is an important picture that Marianne has seen probably several times. This is from modern day Israel and Palestine, and a number of these pictures are of Palestinian farmers that you will see. So this would this would be a village, and I've got, so Marianne, can you see where I'm doing the red arrow around the village site?
Yes, I can.
Okay, all right. So that would be the village. These, all of here would be the farmland. And then there's more farmland working up the slopes here, and you can see where they're terraced. So, oops, wait, sorry, I got to remember not to click. They're terraced along the side there, and that prevents water runoff. More terraces back here. So, and here, down here, there's some trees. They might be olive trees or grapevines, that kind of thing. These might be grapevines here. So, this would be a typical setup. And the reason this is set up this way is you want to save ancient Israel today is a very hilly land, and you save the bottom land for your grain crops and your crops. And the reason is that they need space, as well as all of the water runs downhill. So the water that falls on the mountains or the hills down about will run down, and therefore these crops in the lower valleys will have the best supply of water. The reason your village is on the side here is also that at the bottom of the hill, that's where water runs down. So that village probably grew up around a spring or springs or a water source, because you can't have your village too far from a source of water. But you don't want to encroach on your good farmland. So you put the village kind of on a slope going up off the side of the farmland. Around on this side where you have, these are probably rock terraces. So they're shore up a bit of the hillside, and then they create a flat area. So there's a rock face and then a flat area, and on that flat area you can grow more crops. Often you will grow things like grapevines and dates and nuts and tree kind of crops because their roots will hold the soil. So these families survived because they used absolutely every ecological niche of the land to create some kind of food. So you'd have wheat and barley along on the bottom lands. You'd have grapes and pomegranates and olive trees on the hillsides. You'd probably have a garden near your house for vegetables like leeks and onions. And then for sheep and goats, which are very important sources of milk and cheese and meat, those would be out in the sort of in the outback. You would not devote good land to them. They can graze anywhere. So you'd have your herds of sheep and goats and things like that sort of out in the outback. So by using every niche of land, you were able to, in a village that had a number of farming families, were actually able to create a fairly good economy for yourselves. I'll talk a little later about some of the ways they structured their families to help that. But there were a number of sources of food that you could feed your family with and have pretty good protein sources and things like that. So this is what a village then would have looked like. And you can see kind of the same farmland down on the flat. And here's probably like olive trees or vineyards would be up here. There's some more houses going up the side of the hill. Again, you don't use good bottom land for your houses. Now, this is a modern village, but it's not dissimilar to what an ancient village would have looked like. You have brick or stone or brick, and in many cases they would be mud brick houses that would be built up. They don't have a lot of windows because they didn't have things like glass or whatever, but there'd be an open door where air and light would get in. They have flat roofs, so that the roof is often used as a workspace. You would dry flax up there, and these structures on top actually could be used as sort of outdoor rooms. And particularly in the hot weather, you might sleep on the roof, something like that. So you see you've got an outside stairway going up to the roof. And again, I'll show you more about these houses, but the village then works together, and each sort of, you have all of these different crops, and each one of them is in the best place for that crop to thrive for the family and the group of families in the village. So here's how this might be in the text. So from Deuteronomy 11. If you will only heed the Lord's every commandment that I am commanding you today, so this is Moses talking to the people, loving the Lord your God and serving him with all your heart and with all your soul, then he will give you the rain for your land in its season, the early rain and the later rain. And you will gather in your grain, your wine, and your oil. And he will give grass in your field for your livestock, and you will eat your fill. So there the text, I mean, we would read that and kind of maybe have, okay, so that's talking about rural life. But when you have this picture in your mind, then that text makes more sense. Okay, let's go on. So these are pictures, so probably from 30 or so years ago, of Palestinian farmers. And this is very typical of how basically subsistence agriculture has been done for thousands of years in places where you do not yet have, obviously in the ancient time they didn't have machines to help you do the work. So this is plowing a field with a yoke of oxen. Now that plow tip is probably a metal tip because it's much stronger. In ancient Israel, sometimes the plow tips were iron and sometimes they were wood. Obviously, iron is a lot stronger. So you'd plow the land and then you'd seed the land. Again, this would be sowing the seed in the land. And here another quote from Deuteronomy. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land flowing with streams, with springs and underground waters welling up in valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey, a land where you may eat bread without scarcity, where you will lack nothing, a land whose stones are iron, and from whose hills you may mine copper. And we do know that when ancient Israel was flourishing, so around 1,000 before the Common Era, really all the way down to the New Testament era, but certainly 1,000 down to around 600, iron was the main metal that they were able to mine and then create into various tools and weapons and things like that. And you can see here the main crops are wheat, barley, vines, which give you your grapes as well as wine. Olive oil is used for a number of different things, certainly for cooking, but also for personal care. Honey, a land where you eat bread without scarcity. And the reality is when these villages worked, when they weren't interfered with by the upper classes, when the village worked and there was rain, those are two important things, then people did do okay in these villages because of the way the village was set up and the number of crops they had. A village could be self-sustaining and people could live, they could get enough sustenance to live. It wasn't going to be luxurious, but they could get enough sustenance to live. However, if they were oppressed by the upper classes who were stealing their land or taking too much in taxes, that might change things. And in particular, if there wasn't good rain. This is a rain-dependent type of agriculture. And if there's a year or 2 or 3 of drought, then it can be very, very difficult for the peasants because they can't store food from one season to the next. Okay, so this is harvesting wheat and then winnowing it, separating the chaff from the grains. Both of those are realities, if you'll remember, talked about often in the New Testament. And here's a story from Genesis that talks about making bread. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, excuse me, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly, excuse me, 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." Okay, so there you see a reference to bread making. Well, Here's how you would grind flour. All of these are made of stone, and there are various types of grinders. The first one is called a saddle quern, and the grain is placed on the flat surface, and then this upper stone, it's a millstone or whatever, is used, it's called a millstone, to actually grind the grain. And similarly with these bowls, they would be grinding flour. And of course, there's no refrigeration in the ancient world. So baking bread, making food was an everyday occurrence. So the women of the household were a very important part of the household. They were definitely not just fading flowers who didn't do any work. They were a super important part of the household. Part of their work would be both using the farming in the family garden, the vegetable plot, and perhaps other farming, but then doing all of the cooking as well. And then here's be a typical kind of large, this would be a kind of a community oven. And you can see the woman there is baking a flat bread in that oven. And then here's an olive tree, and the olive oil was very, very important. So it was used as lighting, so they could put a wick in a little dish, and that would be a light for inside your house. It was clearly used for cooking. It was used for personal care, like a cleanser for hair and things like that. And so the olives were eaten. So olive oil was a tremendously important crop, as well as the vineyards. So both eating grapes as well as wine. Remember, again, they don't have sources of necessarily clean water. So a liquid like wine with a little bit of alcohol in it does make water palatable and make it healthier to drink. So wine was a very important, watered down wine would be used, and that would help kill the bacteria and other things in the water that wasn't necessarily clean. So from Micah 4, they shall all sit. This is a vision of sort of an ideal or a well-working village. They shall sit under their own vines and under their own fig trees, and no one shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken it. Now, interestingly, if you read between the lines there, if this is a vision of a well put together, a prosperous village, and a household that's prospering under their own vines and fig trees, the opposite of that must also have been a possible reality, that your vines or your fig trees would have been lost to you because you got into debt and you had to sell your land, you became a debt slave, or someone had cheated you out of your land, or warfare had come and taken you away from your land. So there were things that could happen so that the village was impacted in a negative way. But here, this verse shows you a positive understanding of how well a village could work. This is an olive oil press. So what you have here is that big heavy stone, it's kind of like a donut, would be flopped down on that post in the middle, and there would be a large beam that would be on the top, and a donkey would be on the end of each beam, or a human being, but hopefully a donkey, and that they would take that big donut around in a circle. The olives would be put into the scooped out area there, and they would be ground between the top stone and the bottom stone, releasing the oil. And then there's a little hole right down here that would probably have had a reed in it, and there would be drilled holes so that the oil would seep down, and then it would be stored in various storage bins. So here's from Exodus 27. This is when Moses is being told how to set up the temple, and it's going to it's a sanctuary in the wilderness then, but it'll happen in the temple as well. You would light the sanctuary or the temple with olive oil. There'd be an oil lamp. And so the command is, you shall further command the Israelites to bring you pure oil of beaten olives for the light, so that a lamp may be set up to burn continually. Water was an absolutely key resource, because without water, none of the agriculture of the land that's going to feed the families was going to be able to be possible. So the sources of water were critical, and particularly in a rain-dependent area. If there was a constant spring, in other words, that the sources of water were robust enough that the spring would flow even through the dry season, that was critically important, because then you could get water all the time. And the water would run in the wet season. Obviously, there's more water around. There's rain coming down. People would collect water in cisterns below their houses and then use that during the dry season. And so this is just a picture of a river, a wadi, in the desert that may, in fact, be a wadi that runs all the time, unless there's a terrible drought, and then it may dry up. So the vision in Isaiah of a fruitful land is one where there is always water. So, and Isaiah has this vision of God saying, I will open rivers on the bare heights and fountains in the midst of the valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water and the dry land springs of water. So you can see there how both desirable and necessary water is. And here is a woman pulling up water from a well. And again, that well might have to be dug quite deep to get down to the water table. But if it was a well that was good all year round, then the village would depend on that all the time. Another quote from Isaiah, for I give water in the wilderness, rivers in the desert, to give drink to my chosen people, the people who I have formed for myself, so that they might declare my praise. So water was critical, and a good constant source of water, very critical. The other part, in addition to crops that you would grow, everyone was dependent on sheep in particular, also goats. For the wool that made a lot of their clothing was wool clothing, blankets and things like that. They would, on occasion at least, eat the lambs, mostly on festivals. They're not a meat-heavy society because meat is expensive. You don't want to kill your crop to eat it. You want your sheep to have lambs, so you continue to expand your crop. So, but the milk would be used for cheese and yogurts and things like that. So, sheep were a very important part of the economy and the good balance of crops that a household could depend on. So famously from Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. And this is a scene in the northern part of the country, up near the Jezreel Valley. And then, of course, from the wool, you would be able to, this is a woman carding wool on this side, and then weaving. And they would use various forms of natural dyes and things like that. And that, again, was very important. The household would make its own clothing as well. So the girls and women of the household would learn to become weavers and things like that. So that's sort of the economy of it. But here's the people part of the peasant village household. Everyone lived in extended families. They were patriarchal. It was a patriarchal society. And the family would be headed by the eldest male. And often it would be a couple, like a grandmother and grandfather, but the grandfather would be the head of the household, the patriarch. But then the family was not just what we would consider a nuclear family. It wasn't just parents and children, but it was an extended family. So the brothers would live together, and they would each marry a woman probably from a nearby village, not closely related to them, so a village a day or 3 walk away, or a donkey ride away. And the women would leave their family and come and live with the husband's family. So the extended family would be the patriarch, and then the sons of that patriarch, of each of which would have their own family by marriage. They'd marry a woman and have families. And then all of the, if you will, the cousins would also live together. And 3, 4, 5, 20, 60 of these extended families would make up a village. So that village setting is where the families lived and worked. And of course, then agriculture was their main livelihood. All of this for ancient Israel, however, also was understood theologically. So this wasn't just a secular society. Everyone of that time understood that they were God's people. So, like sort of from Moses on, they understood that God had given them land on which to live as their families, and then create households and villages and towns and cities. But they also understood that the land belonged to God. They didn't have the sense of private property the way we do. So there were households are to care for the land and to produce their sustenance for their families, but the land ultimately belongs to God. There's not private property. And then the households are in covenant with each other and with God. So there is a connectedness among the family, among a set of families, and then all of those families together under the God that they feel was their God, who had rescued them out of slavery in Egypt, had given them the land, and then had created the conditions of good rain and good land for them and their extended families to grow crops and live together as families and extended families in these villages. So all of it was understood theologically as the life, the livelihood that God had given to them, and that therefore their lives were blessed by God when they worked the land and shared the goodness of the land with each other. So the major structure, and you can sort of see the way I've talked about it, of the society was the basic unit was the extended family. So a person really didn't think of themselves so much as an individual. It's not like I am an important person on my own, because everyone thought of themselves as part of a family. So their connection, their self-identity, obviously they knew they were an individual person, but their identity was as part of a household. So you can see that in the text as well. So that little family household, a group of those households together would be in a village. A larger group of villages would be in a clan, and a larger number of clans together would be a tribe. And if you remember those little Russian nesting dolls, where you have a little doll inside a bigger doll, inside a bigger doll, inside a bigger doll, that is the nested household structure of ancient Israel. So the little doll would be the little household, the family, extended family. The next doll up might be a group of families. The next bigger doll up might be the clan. The next bigger doll up might be the tribe. And then all the tribes together make up the state. And again, you can see that in the text. So there's a story in Joshua 7 where Joshua was trying to find out somebody who actually had done something wrong. And he does it by casting lots, which is a way of the ancient world understood that if you cast lots, God will speak through the way basically the dice fall out to help you make a decision. So he's doing that to find out who was the person responsible for a bad action that had been taken. But this text also shows you the nested household structure. So Joshua rose early in the morning and brought Israel near, tribe by tribe, and the tribe of Judah was taken. He brought near the clans of Judah, and the clan of the Zerahites was taken. And he brought near the clan of the Zerahites, household by household, and Zabdi was taken. And he brought near his household one by one, and then finally an individual, Achan, son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, was taken. And so the way that person is identified here, so here's the individual, Achan. Here's his family name. His father is Carmi. His son, that they're together in the extended clan of Zabdi. And Zerah is the Zerahites, is the bigger clan, and then the tribe is Judah. So you've got this nesting of households. You see a similar thing in 1 Samuel 1. There was a certain man of Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was, now listen to how Elkanah is identified. He is Elkanah, but he's also the son of Jeroham, son of Dehu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. So that's a long way of talking about yourself, but that's the way they thought about themselves, as in this nested household structure. So the villages work together because there's a supportive social structure in these rural villages. Extended families share the labor. There is collective land ownership. So your family, the extended family, will hold the land. Again, the land is owned by God, but the extended family holds the land. And given the way that village is set out, you'll have a vineyard up here on the hill, and you might have another vineyard over here, and you'll have a wheat and barley fields down there on the lower part of the valley. You'll have some olive trees over here. You'll have an herb garden perhaps by your house. So your land won't be contiguous. It's not like you own a big estate, but you'll have pieces of land spread out all over the village that your extended family is responsible for. One of the most important social structures that keeps these families together and keeps the whole village working is the responsibility of redemption of indebted persons. So say your cousin, his land isn't so good, or he's a lazy farmer, or he has a string of bad luck or something, and he loses his land and falls into debt. He can't pay his debts at the end of the year. Maybe he's had to buy some seed to put a crop in, and he can't pay it back at the end of the year, so he falls into debt. The cousin's job, responsibility, was to redeem him out of debt. So to pay his debts for him and set him back up on family land. And in many cases, to get the land back out of being basically mortgaged. So if he defaults on his mortgage, the cousins band together, the extended family bands together, and gets them back out of debt and back in their land and set them back up again. Because the village works best when everybody is sharing the tasks of the agricultural work across the extended family. As well as the gate of the city, sort of like the town square, is where the elders of the city, so those patriarchal heads of household would be the elders of the city, and say somebody done something wrong, or, this guy's oxen had gotten into somebody else's field and had trampled the field, and so he brings a complaint to the village elders, and they hear the case, they listen to everybody, and they say, okay, you let your ox out, you were not controlling it, it trampled this other person's land, so you need to pay him the amount of loss of, say, the grain crop that your ox had trampled. And that would be adjudication in the gate by the elders. And then the family, the whole village, if you will, was governed by these families and clan elders. And then a whole set of villages and the clan together. Again, the elders would get together and make decisions. And the system worked pretty well. Okay, so this is some pictures of what the households actually look like. What you have here, this is from an archaeological dig. And they've dug down through layers and layers of other stuff, and they've gotten down, this would be the foundations of a family house. This would be the entrance. This would be the main room right here. Here's your grinding stone set up in the middle of the work area in the center. This actually would have been a small oven called a taboon, and you would have created coals in there and baked on that. These rooms in the back here would be storerooms, and these side rooms probably would have had thatch on the floors and would have been used for storing, having animals in there. And this, I think if I can show this here, one of these stones is set up, that would be a manger, which would have been a feeding trough for the animals in these side areas of the household. So what did that look like? In a city, well, actually, let me go forward. This is what the village would have looked like. And this would be a rural village. And so you have that kind of house. What I've shown you before is just the foundation of a house like this. Would have been probably 2 stories, we think, with a series of beams and then plaster creating the upper and lower floors. There would be a low wall around the area, and that wasn't so much not a defensive wall, but it's to keep children and animals from wandering out and wild animals from wandering in. So there would be like a kitchen garden here. People out in the outer square here are doing various kinds of work. This woman's putting flatbread into an oven. These people are grinding and taking care of children. They're watering a donkey at a trough. So a prosperous extended family village. And it may be that these are two brothers living together in these two households. What do those houses look like? So here is a cutaway view of what one of those houses would have looked like. So this would be the front entrance. Here again is that central, basically the central workspace. That is the main sort of production area. There would have been a fire in the middle for cooking, and there would have been a hole in the second floor, and there would have been a hole here so that the smoke just would have been drawn up through the roof. This woman, they have a cistern in the house, so this woman is drawing water out of the cistern. This is a typical jug that's used for storage. And then here you see the animals along the side. Now, it's a smelly way to keep animals, to basically have a barn in the bottom part of your house. However, it does protect the animals from wild animals that they might, lions and things like that would prey on the sheep and goats. And here's a manger in between two columns. Across the back there would be storage, and then up on the second floor would be living, again some more working, ladders going up, and then there'd be sleeping and areas for the family and stuff like that up on the second floor. Here's an so then what would that household look like in a town or a city? Now, what distinguishes a town and city from a village is a defensive wall. So what you're having pictured here, again, this is a reconstruction based on an archaeological site. The walls were actually two layers. There was an inner wall and an outer wall with like a parapet across the top, where soldiers would be defending the city. And this this is actually a doorway into the wall, so that the walls had quite a bit of space in between them, maybe 8-10 feet in between them, several meters, and you could actually have a house set in between the inner and outer walls of the city. So that was critical for defense. And only a city of a pretty large size would have a double wall like this. But then inside the city, there would be sort of streets. They didn't have a lot of urban planning, at least in some of the smaller cities. But then there would still be a family compound. So here is a cutaway house. And here you see the storage jars and the living space inside. And again, here is a courtyard. You have a woman grinding. You have other donkey drinking at a trough here, other work areas. So again, this might be an extended family. One brother might live here, another brother might live here, and another brother might live here, and they would share the family compound together. Okay. This is the kind of pottery, and that was pottery used for everything. The kind of pottery had these large items are all storage jars, and they obviously don't stand up. They're not flat bottomed. That's because they are sunk into the earth, the earthen floor of a house, because the earth stays a constant like 55 degrees Fahrenheit, and so it actually keeps the contents cool. So you would store oil or your grains, they would have a lid on them, and you'd use a dipper to get whatever you wanted out of that storage jar. These various things down here are various kinds of juglets and pots. You can see on this one here, there's actually blackened stuff on the outside. Oops, wait. As well as on here. So these pots would be fired, but then they'd be used for cooking on a fire. This was probably a water jug. This here is actually an oil lamp. So out of this little spout here would have been a little cotton wick, and then the oil would have been placed here, and that would have been lit, and that would have provided light in the house. So various forms. None of this is like fine china. Your nicest piece is actually over here because it has a little bit of red burnish on it, but most of this stuff is very utilitarian. And then your main form of transportation is donkeys. That's the way you travel. You probably use them somewhat for riding, but you also use them as a beast of burden for carrying stuff. So again, from 1 Samuel 9, now the donkeys of Kish, which is Saul's father, had strayed. So he said to his son, take one of the young men with you and go and look for the donkeys. A donkey is a very, very important part of the household economy. And now this is a picture from a temple in Egypt. But what it shows is an Egyptian rendering of a Semitic tribe. So these are people who might in fact have come from the land of Canaan and had come down to Egypt to trade or perhaps to live there during a time of drought. And so this shows you sort of typical the way they might have looked and dressed, that they here use donkeys for transportation. Their children are on the donkeys and other beasts of burdens. I think this is a lyre, which is interesting, or shown, but here also is a bow and arrows and things like that, and a spear. So this gets you a sense of how the people might have looked. Now this is through an Egyptian lens at non-Egyptian people. Okay, so some other texts that show you a little bit about this land. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So this is from the 10 Commandments in the book of Deuteronomy, but it also has a very good description of the household. 6 days you shall labor and do your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, or your male or female slave, or your ox or your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the resident alien in your towns, so that your male and female slave may rest as well as you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So the reason for the Sabbath in Deuteronomy is so that the household can rest, and that it gives you this really very good little description of what that extended family household was like. You see a similar reference in the next commandment, honor your father and mother, as the Lord your God commanded you, so your days may be long and it may go well with you in the land your God is giving you. Okay, so you know what? I think because we're almost at the end of our hour, that is the presentation on the village and the family and the land and agriculture. A little bit, I had more on the monarchy, but this is really the core of this, is what it was like to live in an ancient Israelite village. And this then gives us a few minutes left for some questions or whatever you'd like to question. Does that sound good, Marianne?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, every time I hear this lecture, I wish it was still the way life was.
I know.
You know?
Yeah.
It's just, there's something, it is in India, like other places, it is.
Right.
This is how people,
Right.
still live in agricultural areas,
Right.
but
Right.
we're so individualistic.
Yeah, this form of life for most of human history, people have lived in villages doing this kind of agriculture. It's only since the industrial era in like the 1800s, so it's only really the last 300 years where we've had the industrialization, and therefore we live in much, much larger cities, etc. But most of humanity, for most of human history, have lived in villages like this, and as you say, some people still do. And if there's good water sources and relatively decent land, and the people can work together, it's a fairly stable life. You can create enough food to feed your family and, have up and coming generations and stuff like that. It's fragile though, because if there's a drought or if there's a war going on, your neighbor wants to take over your state, war disrupts everything. Or if the upper classes take advantage of the lower classes, then life can become very, very hard because the lower class people don't necessarily have a champion to stand up for them if a big landlord or if an unfair tax collector or the king wants your land, the king is going to get that land. So there's elements of this life that are very fragile if certain things go wrong, but when things are okay, there's enough rain, the village is well situated, you can live a pretty good life. Okay, so I'm open to questions for our last few minutes here.
When you talked about the covenant piece of it, it reminded me that I think, is that not what the Mennonites and the Hutterites, like, that's the form of living that they have, right?
Yep.
It's
And
the
I think
covenant.
and I think they would similarly understand that this is a kind of a blessed way, that this would be instituted by God as a sort of a blessed way
Right.
to live close to the land like that, and then in extended families, and the family unit really supports each other, and that I think that would be a good parallel to what you see in ancient Israel.
Mhm.
Other questions? Let me just say a little bit then more about the role of women. So it is a patriarchal society, there's no doubt about it. But in the village, the women actually have a lot of responsibility and in the extended family were really part of the household economy. They were valued. They had certain roles. I mean, most traditional societies have distinct roles for men and women, and younger women and older men and older women, etc. But they weren't oppressed in the sense of not doing anything and not being valued. They were highly valued, and in fact, were a big, important part of the household economy. And some of the women would have, if they'd become very good weavers, perhaps, they would have extra, they would be able to have extra woven materials that they might sell in a village marketplace. So they might also have a form of income for themselves, or they might have, vegetables that they might sell, or things like that. So that the women were an incredibly important part of this household economy. They were under the control, if you will, of the men of the family, but it's not that they were also valued. So it's important to see that role for women as well. So other questions or comments?
All through the Hebrew Bible, we see polygamy. I'm wondering at what point that shifted to monogamy, because these
Yeah.
villages would have depended on having lots of people.
Yes, they would. And in fact, um, probably polygamy was the norm for a lot of this time because children often died in childbirth, or, a certain percentage didn't make it to age 5. I mean, they don't have, all the kinds of medical care that we have. And the way, say, if a husband died, the woman needed the extended family to take care of her, and then to have a big enough household. Often there were 2 wives. There wouldn't be like a harem. I mean, that it's not like multiple like wives where people are taken advantage of. It would be a first wife and a second wife kind of thing. I think that actually persists for quite a while. I don't know exactly when. It would have been at least because I think it's still also in the New Testament era, you have some with multiple wives. So I don't know exactly when it would have died out, but it really was completely acceptable. And it still is in many villages. It's a way for women to be taken care of, because a woman on her own is quite vulnerable if she's not well integrated into the family. Other questions?
Just a comment. I really appreciated your pictures of the dig and the tools. You know, they're
Hmm.
jugs that look so rudimentary, but they made them work,
They
obviously.
did, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. And in fact, probably the discovery of iron is one of the key discoveries that allowed ancient Israel to get its hold on the land. So that would be around 1200 before the Common Era. And that's right when iron both had been discovered, but also they'd figured out how to harden iron. Iron is not a very hard metal unless you heat it and cool it and heat it and cool it, which is what a blacksmith does. You can harden the iron, and that makes a much stronger plow tip. It makes stronger weapons and that kind of thing. So the discovery of iron and usable iron allowed the early tribes, as well as the Canaanites, and the Israelites really emerged out of the Canaanites in the hill country of Palestine. Having good plows allowed them to farm land that was pretty marginal, very rocky, because it's up on the hills and like just little valleys and but lots of hilly stuff. So iron was really critical to have iron tools, plows and scythes and things like that, to actually just allow Israel to get the ancient Israelites to get a place to create these villages on the land. Other comments or questions?
Can you share a little bit more about the dig that you brought?
Yeah, it was in, it's up north. It was east of the Sea of Galilee. It was in a place called Tel Rehov. And it was the layers that we were digging in were actual layers in ancient Israelite time period. So many of these cities, especially some of the big cities, have layer on layer of occupation going well back into the Middle Bronze Age and before. And so, of course, because it's a layer, the recent stuff is on top. And as you dig down, you get older and older and older. So when I was there, the year I went to that dig, they were at a layer that was in around the 9th or 10th century before the Common Era. And it was a small Israelite city. So it had a wall, and it was fortified. And we were digging in a couple of different areas. And the area that I was spent the whole month digging in was actually an area very similar to that urban slide that I showed you, where you have the little houses around a courtyard. And we were spending a lot of time digging out the courtyard. And just kind of layer by layer. You have to work very, very carefully. Sometimes it's incredibly delicate because you're dealing so there was a layer of, they must have put down like a reed mat for part of to create a part of a flat area, maybe inside a house or as part of this outdoor area. And as we dug down, we got to the top of the mat where the mat had been. Now, the mat wasn't there anymore, but the outlines of the reeds were still there. And so I spent 4 or 5 days literally with a toothbrush, a paintbrush, and a tiny little chip, because if I went too fast, I would destroy the outlines of the reeds that were what was left of the reeds from this mat. And it turned out I'm a very careful worker. Who knew? I didn't know that until I did this archaeological dig. And they realized that, and they said, okay, your job is to get the top layer very carefully off of this so we can see what's left of the reed mat. And they just let me work on that for a couple of days. And it was painstaking, but it was very cool, because when I got the top layer very carefully off, you could see the whole place where the reed mat had been. It was still kind of the outline of it was still in the dirt where they had the reed mat. There was another area in this courtyard where we were digging up one of the ovens. So they had clearly had an oven outdoor in the courtyard that maybe the extended families around the courtyard all used the common oven. And as you dug down there, you found the hardened ceramic bowl of the oven, but then we were digging down and you could see the layers of ash from the way they had cooked in that oven, which was also very cool. And then the final thing I'll say is we found tons and tons and tons and tons of broken pottery. So, I mean, that pottery, ceramics, were the basic way of all your sort of household goods were made of pottery. All of your goods for transporting oil or whatever would have been in a pot. You know, they didn't have plastics, they didn't have glass, whatever, so you'd have pots. And we just found so many pieces of broken pottery because it was pottery. It wasn't even all that well made. And so at the end of the day, we'd carefully preserve every piece of pottery that we found. And rarely would you find something whole. And we used to joke, I mean, those of us who were working in the area, they must have just spent their entire time throwing pottery at each other and breaking it over their heads because there's just tons of broken pottery. But every piece was saved as you dug it up. And you try to, you didn't want to damage it further. So when you found an edge of a piece of pottery, you dug it up carefully. And we'd work in the morning. It was very hot. It was during the summer. So we'd get up and we'd get out to the site by 5 in the morning. And then we'd work till around noon where it would just get way too hot. And then we'd go back and we'd all take naps and showers and then naps because you were totally filthy. And then late in the afternoon, we'd sit under the trees, and that was our pottery washing time because you washed every piece of pottery by hand because if it had any kind of decoration or writing on it, it got saved. Because that was, there was so much broken pottery around, just a regular, bottom of a pot or something wasn't saved. But if it had any kind of writing or any kind of decoration on it, and some would be a little decorated, they'd be painted or something like that, then that would get cataloged and saved. So there were like 200 of us working on the site that summer. And all of us would sit under the trees when it was cooler later in the afternoon, and we'd wash pottery. And if you found something, you trotted it over to the table of the professional archaeologists and say, okay, I found a piece of painted pottery, and they'd keep it. But then also, the rest was just thrown out. And so we would all of us were able to bring back little pieces of pottery from things that we had dug up because they're just going to throw it away. It's not really worth anything. So,
Cool.
yeah. So it was very cool. Yeah, did have a sense of, wow, this was you had the sense of how people actually lived in this ancient city. The other story I have to tell you, the other thing we had to watch out for was scorpions because they lived in the walls. So you had to just always kind of keep a trowel or a shovel or something near because if you were digging, there was one day we took a wall down because they were finished with all of the measuring and stuff that they want to do. So they called all 200 of us over and handed us pickaxes, and we just basically slugged at them and tried to clear the wall. And they had bucket brigades putting, stuff off the wall and whatever. And you had to be really careful because scorpions lived in the walls, and you just had to be really fast. They were more scared of us than we were of them, which is saying something because we were very scared of them. But you also just had to try to be quick to step on them or smash them with your pickaxe. So that was a little bit fun.
Okay, are there any other final questions on that note? It sounds very Indiana Jones.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A little bit.
Yeah. And just making the Bible like 3D. Like
Yeah.
we were doing a chosen discussion group, and it kind of reminds me of that. Like suddenly it comes to life when you've got kind of, you can
Right.
picture it more realistic.
Yeah.
Any other final questions? Okay. So thank you so much, Pat. That was
You're
amazing.
very welcome.
That was
You're
wonderful.
welcome.
Thank you so much for taking the time to do this for us.
You're very welcome.
And everybody, this is the last of our series, so very sad, but it's over for now. Next Wednesday is Ash Wednesday, and then those of you who are in my Lent book study, we'll be doing a Lent book study, and it looks like it'll be on Zoom because I know, Gail, you're going away. So we will do a Lent on Zoom.
Okay,
But
great.
yeah, that's everything. So thank you again, Pat, and
Okay,
thank you,
thank
everybody,
you.
and
Okay,
bye.
take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.